A blade buried in ice. That's how they found it. Silent, preserved, and cold as the grave it once stood over. No inscriptions. No royal emblems. Just a simple military officer's sword. Forgotten in a temple wall hidden behind frozen stone. But among those who knew the name, the story was anything but silent. They said he died for a king who no longer ruled. That his loyalty was both his glory and his downfall. And before the sword froze in the stone, it had carved the fate of an entire kingdom. His name was Choi Young. To understand who he became, we must return to the time when he was no more than a boy standing at the edge of a world crumbling from within. The Goryeo dynasty had already weathered centuries of war, submission, and survival. From the Mongol invasions to the ceaseless grip of Yuan rule, Korea was no longer its own master. The court wore silk, but their oaths were sown from fear. The king bowed not only to heaven, but also to emperors far beyond the yellow sea. And in this storm of obedience and pride, a child was born into a military household that valued neither politics nor comfort, but only service. The house of Choi was old, its roots traced back to aristocrats and commanders, but there was little opulence left in its halls. Choi Young was raised not to inherit wealth, but to inherit discipline. His father, a grizzled veteran of frontier skirmishes, taught him that honor was not a birthright, but a burden, and that true warriors do not accumulate, they shed. Shed comfort, shed fear, shed desire. So while other boys were learning poetry or the courtly arts, Choi Young was learning to sleep without a pillow and eat rice laced with ash, so that he would never grow too fond of softness. He came of age during a time when Goryeo's heart beat quietly, but its body bled from 1,000 cuts. Mongol rule had technically loosened, but their fingerprints remained everywhere, from administrative codes to the fashion of the palace guards. Piracy was rising along the southern coasts. Rebels stirred in the far provinces, and famine crept through the countryside like a wolf that never left. Yet amid all this, Choi Young did not seek to rise. He sought to endure. His first command was small, a detachment of ragged conscripts assigned to patrol a quiet district plagued by minor unrest. Most commanders used such postings to enrich themselves. Choi Young did not. When a merchant offered him a golden ring in exchange for protection, Choi Young melted it down and used it to forge arrowheads for his poorest archers. Gold, he later said, is heavy. A warrior must walk light. Word spread quickly of the strange young officer who refused bribes, refused gifts, and even refused promotion unless it came directly from the king's order. The military soon recognized something rare in him, not just talent, but incorruptibility. He could not be bought, which made him both valuable and dangerous. Ministers debated whether to bring him closer to the capital or keep him in the provinces where he could do less harm politically. But the king at the time, Gongmin, had other plans. Tired of the stifling Mongol influence, Gongmin sought to restore autonomy to Goryeo. And for that, he needed men like Choi Young, men who did not flinch. By the time Choi Young reached the capital, the court was no longer a palace of silk and tea, it was a hive of nervous eyes. Ministers whispered, eunuchs schemed, and foreign diplomats watched every move like predators circling a wounded animal. The king had dismissed pro-Yuan officials, shocking the entire region. He began purging corrupt aristocrats, and it was Choi Young who was summoned to escort many of them into exile or into shallow graves. Blood followed his footsteps, not because he craved it, but because his loyalty required it. The capital feared him, but the army revered him. And in this paradox, Choi Young began to understand his place in history, not as a peacemaker, nor a reformer, but as the sword of the realm. A sword that had no place in politics, only in war. And war, as it turned out, was never far. In the north, the remains of Mongol loyalists still controlled key fortresses, especially the strategic Sangseong prefecture. These were lands that rightfully belonged to Goryeo but had been surrendered during earlier invasions. The king ordered a campaign to retake them, and it was Choi Young who would lead it. He marched not with grandeur, but with a chilling resolve. His men described him as eerily silent in the mornings. Before battle, his eyes like still water, deep, unreadable, and calm before the storm. The assault on Sangseong was brutal. The fortress sat nestled among mountain passes, guarded by seasoned troops, and steep terrain. Choi Young refused to wait for winter to pass. He launched a surprise offensive, climbing icy ridges with frostbitten men who followed only because they believed that he would never ask of them what he would not do himself. The siege took weeks. Supplies dwindled. The snow turned crimson. But on the final night, Choi Young ordered a night assault using burning tar and silent archers to blind and weaken the defenses. When dawn broke, the Goryeo banners flew once again over Sangseong. It was a victory not just of strategy, but of sheer, unrelenting conviction. That battle elevated Choi Young into legend. The king honored him with titles, but Choi returned to the capital empty-handed, having distributed all his battlefield rewards among the wounded and the families of the dead. The people began calling him the living sword, pure, sharp, and unforgiving. But not all celebrated his rise. Within the palace, factions that had once been loyal to the Mongol influence now saw Choi as a threat, not merely because of his military power, but because he had something far more dangerous: moral legitimacy. A man who fights and lives like a monk cannot be negotiated with, he cannot be shamed, and he cannot be controlled. One minister famously said, "A man who owns nothing fears nothing, and a man who fears nothing will be the death of kings." Whether it was prophecy or paranoia, it was not entirely wrong. But Choi Young did not seek to unsettle the throne. On the contrary, his loyalty to the king was near absolute, perhaps dangerously so. He believed in the divine right of kings, and in the idea that a soldier's life belonged not to himself, but to the ruler he served. In this, he was both noble and naive. That blind spot would cost him everything. The chapter ends not with triumph, but with foreshadowing. A boyish young officer stands quietly in the back of a crowded war room, watching Choi Young deliver a briefing to the king. That young officer's name is Unsung. His eyes are alert, calculating, but his lips smile in admiration. For now, and somewhere far from the palace, in a simple house with a paper lantern, flickering in the dusk, a woman waits. She is Choi Young's wife, rarely spoken of, even less seen. But she, too, senses the change. In her silence, there is grief for a man being pulled into something no sword can cut through. Not politics, not betrayal, but time itself. And time, like ice, always wins in the end. The capital welcomed him like a returning god. Drums echoed from palace gates. The scent of incense curled through the city's narrow alleys, and the people bowed as his horse passed. But Choi Young felt nothing. Triumph did not sit easily on his shoulders. Victory to him was not an occasion, it was a necessity. And necessity rarely came with celebration. His eyes remained forward. As banners flew above the palace, emblazoned with royal symbols, not his. That was how he preferred it. The sword should never outshine the hand that wields it. He reminded himself of that daily. But others did not. They whispered that he had become more than a general, that his name, not the king's, stirred loyalty in the army, that his presence in the court unsettled men more than any foreign threat. He was aware of the murmurs, but he did not chase them. What unsettled him more was the look in the king's eyes. Once bright with vision, they had grown dull, fogged by sleepless nights, haunted by treachery. King Gongmin had changed. His reforms were no longer bold, but erratic. He lashed out unpredictably, favoring flatterers one day and condemning them the next. The assassination of Queen Noguk had carved something out of him that never returned. And while Choi Young remained his most loyal commander, he began to wonder if the loyalty was to the man or to the idea of monarchy itself. Still, loyalty bound him. When pirates descended upon the southern provinces, merciless, organized, and emboldened, Choi Young was once again summoned. He accepted without question. And as always, he fought not to win favor, but to protect a kingdom that could barely protect itself. The southern coast was chaos. Villages burned, grain stores emptied, and entire communities were taken for ransom or slaughtered. The court had ignored the problem for years, focusing on diplomatic posturing with the Yuan and now the Ming. But Choi Young wasted no time in diplomacy. He gathered what forces he could. Farmers conscripted overnight, former bandits seeking redemption, monks turned bowmen and marched. His victories came not through overwhelming strength, but through discipline. He demanded complete silence during night operations, banned plunder, and executed officers who defied orders. His army became a ghost that moved through the dark, terrifying in its precision. Within months, pirate fleets fled at the mere sight of Goryeo sails. The coast was pacified, but the scars it left on Choi Young's men would not fade easily. He watched boys turn into killers and men into shadows. When he returned to the capital, he spoke not of victory, but of the price it demanded. And still, the court did not listen. Power had become a game of courtiers. Ministers maneuvered behind lacquered screens, trading influence like coin. Even as Choi Young stood as the kingdom's greatest military asset, his enemies began to multiply. Not with swords, but with scrolls and signatures. They accused him of overreach, of building a private cult of personality among the army. One even claimed that Choi had declared himself king in a drunken toast. Lie so bold it would have been laughable had it not come with official seals. To silence them, the king offered Choi Young a marriage alliance with one of the court's noble families, a symbolic gesture meant to tie him to the political class. But Choi refused. His wife, Seo Hwa, had remained quietly in the background, tending to orphans of war, healing the wounded, and praying in the temple courtyards. She had no title, no family name that mattered in politics. But she was his anchor. When she fell ill, Choi did not leave her side for 3 days, a rare absence from duty. He whispered to her about the battles he never spoke of in court. He told her about soldiers who died with eyes open, and boys who never learned fear before they learned death. She listened, not as a healer, but as the only person who saw him not as a general, but as a man slowly unraveling. She died that winter. The snow fell silently outside their modest home, untouched by any royal decoration. Choi Young wore no mourning colors. He did not weep in public. He returned to court the next morning and took up command as if nothing had happened. But something had. From that day forward, a coldness settled into him. Not bitterness, but detachment. He became even more inflexible. Ministers who once feared him now began to hate him. They accused him of being heartless, unbending, blind to nuance. He offered no defense. He simply bowed, turned, and walked away. Let them say what they will. His loyalty was not to their approval. It was during this period that he met the man who would eventually undo him, Unsung. At first, Choi Young saw promise in the young general. He was clever, tactically brilliant, and spoke with a careful humility that bordered on charm. The soldiers respected him. The people adored him. He came from a border clan that had risen through merit, not inheritance, a background Choi respected. He brought into several campaigns, mentoring him not just in war, but in moral clarity. Or so he thought. What Choi Young did not see or chose not to see was that was not bound by the same code. He spoke of loyalty to the people, not the king. He questioned the cost of war. He advocated diplomacy over force. And while Choi saw this as idealism, saw it as strategy. He knew the kingdom was dying, and he was already imagining. Every council meeting, every shared meal, Choi would speak of loyalty. Would nod, but his silence spoke volumes. Back in court, the king grew more erratic. He ordered executions with little cause. He dismissed advisors for imagined slights. Choi Young remained his shield, absorbing the consequences, deflecting the rage of the court. But even he could not stop the inevitable. One night, a group of masked assassins slipped into the palace. The king was stabbed in his chamber. The murder was called an inside job, though no one was charged. Some whispered it was revenge for his purges. Others claimed foreign hands. But the result was the same: King Gongmin was dead. Choi Young stood over the body of the only man he had ever served, blood staining the marble floor, and realized that the world he had bled for was vanishing. The new king, weak and young, was little more than a puppet. The court factions reemerged stronger than ever, and Choi's authority was now subject to their games. He should have left, retired, fled, but he did not. His path, like his sword, was straight. And so, when the new ministers proposed a campaign against Ming China to reclaim Goryeo's honor and autonomy, Choi Young, despite his doubts, agreed. It would be his final march. He requested Unsung as his second-in-command. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that the young general still shared his code. He did not know that had already been approached by the court, that secret meetings had been held, that promises had been made. As the army gathered near the northern border, watching the river below, and for the first time in decades, questioned not his orders but himself. What if loyalty was the very thing that was killing the country? And if so, had he become not its sword, but its executioner? The river cut like a blade through the mountains, still and silver under the fading light. It marked more than a boundary. It was a line between past and future, between the dying breath of an old order and the first tremor of a new one. On its banks, thousands of men set up camp, soldiers of Goryeo, veterans of Choi Young's many campaigns, and new recruits who had only heard tales of his sword. And silence. Among them, tents rustled in the early spring wind, and voices whispered anxiously about the coming march north, into Ming territory, into uncertain war. Choi Young stood alone on a ridge, staring into the dusk, unmoving even as the wind whipped his robes. He felt the weight of this campaign in a way no other had touched him. Not because of fear, for he feared little now. Years and the scars, and closed his eyes. The prayer was wordless. It had always been. He did not ask for victory. He did not ask for protection. He merely sat in stillness, seeking clarity from within. But clarity no longer came so easily. Behind him, Unsung approached. The younger general moved like a cat, fluid, alert, always watching. He had become a hero in his own right. The people called him the Bow of the East for his unmatched archery and cunning. His men adored him. His officers followed him with quiet intensity. And Choi Young still believed in him, even as he sensed a distance growing between them. They exchanged few words that night. Reported the troops were prepared, supplies arranged, scouts returned. All efficient, all expected. But Choi noticed something in Yi's eyes, something unresolved. He watched the younger man hesitate for a moment before turning to leave, as if there were something more he wanted to say. But the silence held, and the opportunity passed. The next day, the army moved north. Step by step, the banners of Goryeo advanced into unfamiliar territory, through mountain passes, along old trade roads now silent under the threat of retaliation. Yet for all its size, the army moved cautiously. The closer they approached the frontier, the more officers began to murmur. Why now? Unsung, whose instincts rarely failed him, began to voice concern. He sent private messages to court ministers, questioning the campaign's logic. He argued that the timing was poor, that the risks outweighed the gains. He even suggested withdrawal. But these messages did not reach Choi Young, or if they did, he gave no indication. Choi remained committed. He believed in resolve. He believed that retreat invited collapse. To hesitate was to betray not only command but the very idea of military virtue. He remembered the days when hesitation meant death under Mongol siege, when pausing meant watching cities fall. He would not bend to fear now, even if fear wore the face of reason. But beneath his certainty, cracks had begun to form. His dreams were no longer peaceful. He saw Seo Wa in them, not as he remembered, but distant, always walking away. He saw soldiers with no faces, calling out to him from burning cities. And sometimes he awoke with the bitter taste of several ministers, those who had once backed the campaign, had reversed course. The young king was under pressure to call the army back. And worst of all, Unsung had received secret orders from, had finally drained. As Yi's army returned south, Choi Young remained behind for a day. He stood where the river forked and watched the morning fog roll across the water. His men, confused and frightened, begged for orders. But none came. He simply dismissed them one by one, releasing them from obligation. And then he too turned south, not as a commander but as a man walking back into a kingdom that no longer wanted him. When he arrived in Goryeo, the court was silent. Ministers who once groveled now refused to meet his eyes. Unsung had seized control without bloodshed. The king was removed, replaced by a child monarch with Yi as regent. The coup was called a restoration, and Choi Young, once the savior of Goryeo, was now branded its threat. He was arrested without trial, confined in a government building once guarded by his own men. The halls smelled of old incense and new power. Days passed. No one visited. No one asked for his side of the story. At night, he prayed, but the silence returned no answers. In his final letter, never delivered, he wrote not of betrayal nor of politics, but of clarity. I followed the sword, he wrote, but the sword cuts in all directions. I thought I knew which way it pointed, and then he wrote no more. Winter came early that year, and it came without mercy. The wind that swept through the capital seemed sharper than before, as if the land itself knew that something irreversible had taken place. The palace no longer bore the emblem of Choi Young's victories. His banners were removed. His name was scratched from temple tablets. In the same halls where he had once been summoned with honor, his presence was now treated like a contamination, something to be scrubbed from memory rather than remembered in reverence. He was confined, not in a dungeon, but in a small chamber near the edge of the royal complex, a calculated humiliation. It was a space once reserved for minor scribes, narrow and drafty, with a view of nothing but a stone wall covered in frost. The kind of place where time moved slowly enough to become a weapon. But Choi Young did not rage. He did not cry out. He sat in silence, his back straight, his breath measured. The body may have weakened, but the mind remained unbent. Outside, the new regime celebrated its bloodless victory. Unsung, now the de facto ruler, was praised for sparing lives and restoring order. Ministers once afraid of their own shadows now walked proudly in court. Edicts were issued in the name of reform. Grain stores were reopened. Land redistribution was promised. The people, weary from years of corruption and hunger, welcomed the change. For many, the name Choi Young became irrelevant, a relic of a harsher, older world. But not everyone forgot. In temples and rural outposts, among soldiers and villagers who had, what haunted him most was not betrayal, but the possibility that Unsung had been right. What if the kingdom needed a different kind of strength? One that bent, adapted, negotiated? Had his own unyielding code become a form of blindness? Had he clung too long to something that had already died? Outside, snow fell again. It blanketed the palace rooftops and silenced the markets. He addressed her not as a memory, but as if she were still sitting across from him, pouring tea, asking nothing from him but truth. I never doubted the king, he wrote, but I should have doubted the world. He folded the letter, placed it beneath the mat where he used to sleep, and closed his eyes. He did not pray that night, not because he had lost faith, but because he finally accepted that. Etched into the memory of soldiers who had once followed him through fire. In the mountain provinces, old veterans lit incense not to the new ruler, but to the general who had walked into death with his back straight and his silence unbroken. Across Goryeo, a legend began to grow. Not a martyr, not a hero, something quieter. a man who had refused to bend, and for that had been broken. But the new regime had no time for ghosts. Unsung, now in firm control of the royal court, moved swiftly. The monarchy still existed in name, but the real power sat behind his seal. Ministers loyal to the old ways were quietly removed. Temples were instructed to shift their allegiances. The young puppet king issued decrees with a trembling hand while he crafted a vision of Korea, unshackled from both Mongol subjugation and Goryeo stagnation. And yet, he did not declare a new dynasty. Not yet. He knew the country was not ready. The people needed stability before change. The court needed to believe the revolution was temporary. So he waited. He built alliances. He rewarded loyalty. And he watched. But even as he consolidated power, he was haunted not by regret, but by something more corrosive: doubt. Choi Young's death had solved a political problem, but not a moral one. There were nights when he sat alone in his private quarters, a candle burning low, and reread the reports from Waiwa Island. He remembered the look in Choi's eyes when they last stood face to face. Not anger, not fear, but something else. Disappointment, perhaps. Or worse, understanding, as if Choi had known even then that this was how the story would end. Still, he pressed on. To secure his legitimacy, he needed to complete what the Goryeo court had failed to do: create a Korea that could defend itself militarily, economically, ideologically. He initiated land reforms, strengthened borders, and restructured the military. But each move reminded him of Choi Young. The very things he was praised for were the same things Choi had been punished for pursuing. Only he had the foresight to execute them under his own name. There was an irony to it so bitter he could not speak it aloud. Then came the march of the old guard. In the rural provinces, former officers who had served under Choi Young began to rally in secret. They did not aim to restore the monarchy or to rebel. They had no banner, no official claim, only one message: never forget. What began as simple shrine offerings turned into midnight gatherings, then into organized memorials. The regime labeled them dissidents. He tried to downplay the movement, fearing it would breathe life into a ghost he had tried to bury. But what he failed to understand was that Choi Young had not died in that courtyard. He had multiplied. Each man who remembered him, each woman who whispered his story to her child, became another fragment of his unfinished march. The paradox thickened. The more Unsung tried to usher in a new age, the more he realized it stood on the very foundation built by the man he had destroyed. His new military codes borrowed from Choi's doctrines. His moral justifications echoed Choi's writings. Even his symbolic claim to protect the people had once been the very oath Choi Young had taken to protect the throne. And yet, he had killed him. There was no ceremony for the man who had turned the nation on its head. No parade. No coronation. He knew that if he wanted to step into history, it could not be as a usurper. It had to be as a founder. But to found something new, one must first erase what came before or rewrite it. He chose to rewrite. In the years that followed, textbooks were amended. Stories were changed. Choi Young's campaigns were reframed as excessive. His devotion to the monarchy labeled as outdated, rigid, even dangerous. The young were taught that while he was once a great general, he had failed to adapt, and that failure had nearly doomed the country. But the old knew better. They remembered the man who had ridden into frozen battle with nothing but rice and iron, who had given his rewards to widows, who had prayed not for conquest, but for clarity. They remembered the man who had once stood at the river's edge, alone, watching the future march in the opposite direction. Unsung eventually did what everyone expected. He dissolved the Goryeo dynasty. He declared a new order, Joseon, a nation that would define Korea for centuries. He named himself king. Taejo. He built a new capital. He restructured everything, except his memory. For all his triumphs, there was one name he could never erase. Not from the land, not from the silence, and not from his own reflection. He saw it in statues that refused to crumble, in soldiers who still practiced old formations, in the stubbornness of the mountain people. in the way snow fell just before winter, as if, even when punished, was not weakness but a kind of freedom no regime could ever fully kill. In the official annals of the Joseon court, the execution of Choi Young was reduced to a footnote, sanitized, procedural, devoid of emotion. A line of ink that read simply, "The former general was rebellion." It did not curse the new order. It simply told the truth. And in a world freshly obsessed with hierarchy and order, truth had become dangerous. King Taejo never acknowledged the letter publicly, but his actions in the following years grew cautious. He stepped back from reforms. He allowed more temples to honor older traditions. And eventually he abdicated, not from illness, but from exhaustion. He handed the crown to his son, hoping that youth would do what age could not. But even that hope unraveled. His sons turned on one another, clawing for power in a palace soaked with ambition. One prince was murdered in his chambers. Another disappeared in exile. The throne, meant to be a symbol of rebirth, became a reflection of everything Choi Young had once warned against. Ambition without roots, loyalty without conscience, progress without soul. It was during this time that statues began to appear, not in cities but in villages. Carved from simple stone, they bore no inscription, but the face was unmistakable. Stern, silent, eyes cast forward, unblinking. These were not commissioned by the court. They rose from the hands of those who had not forgotten. Farmers who had once fought under his banner. Children who had grown up on stories of a man who gave everything and asked for nothing. Artists who had no royal patrons, only memory. In one remote monastery, a mural appeared on a temple wall. It depicted two men standing on opposite sides of a river. One held a scroll. The other held a sword planted in the ground. Between them, a line of fire and mist. The inscription beneath it read, "The sword does not hate the scroll, but the scroll forgets what it owes to the sword." King Taejo never visited that monastery. But in his final years, he commissioned a private shrine within the palace, small, spare, facing north. He did not explain its purpose. No name adorned its gate, only a white banner that read, "Forgotten in marble," and somewhere far from the capital, in a clearing where snow fell without witness, a single sword stood upright in the earth. No plaque, no guards, no tribute, just the blade, rusting slowly, still pointing north. The sword turned inward long ago. Now it simply waited. They offered him a way out. Long after the war had ended, long after Unsung had become King Taejo of Joseon and Choi Young's name had been struck from court records, there came one final gesture. It was quiet, unofficial, and wrapped in the language of reconciliation. A minister, young, ambitious, and eager to cleanse the conscience of a new regime, brought word from the palace. The message was simple. If Choi Young would publicly acknowledge the wisdom of the new order, if he would bow, even once, to the idea that the revolution had saved the nation, his execution might be reconsidered. He would not be reinstated. He would not be celebrated. But he might be allowed to live. In exile, perhaps. In silence. Forgotten, but not erased. The offer was made with formality, but it trembled with urgency. Because even after his arrest, even after his humiliation, Choi Young remained a problem not of politics, but of memory. His image lingered. His legend would not fade. And as long as he remained unbroken, the court could not fully claim moral victory. He was given 3 days to consider. He spent them not in prayer, nor in consultation, but in absolute stillness. The guards who watched him described it later as eerie. He did not speak. He did not eat. He simply sat, eyes half closed, as if communing with something far deeper than law or kings or history. Perhaps it was his wife he spoke to in silence. Perhaps it was the voices of fallen comrades. Or perhaps it was the land itself, the soil of Goryeo he had once sworn to die defending, and which now no longer carried that name. When the time came, he stood without assistance. He had aged visibly in confinement. His hair, once bound neatly under his helmet, had grown long and gray, each other as they crossed dark waters. Soldiers repeated it at campfires, drawing lines in the dirt with their swords. He had not fought. He had not shouted. He had not even resisted. He had simply refused to kneel, and that refusal became more powerful than any rebellion. In time, temples began to honor him in secret. They did not call him saint or hero. They called him the standing man. In murals, he was depicted not in battle, but in the quiet moment before his death. Tall, weathered, alone, yet unshaken. He became not a symbol of war, but of moral stillness in a world that demanded compromise. King Taejo heard of these stories. He dismissed them in court, but alone he could not escape them. One night, many years after the dynasty had been secured and the capital moved to a new city, the king wandered the palace gardens alone. The moon was high, the trees bare, and in the stillness of winter, he imagined a figure standing at the edge of the path. Not in armor, not in judgment, just standing, watching. He closed his eyes, hoping to forget. But some legacies are not carried by memory. They are carried by silence. And that silence had never left, died. But a standard had survived. One that could not be rewritten, and would not kneel. Scholars in long robes spoke of hierarchy and harmony. The Confucian codes were inscribed into law. Temples once central to the soul of the kingdom were repurposed or razed. Families rewrote their ancestry to sever old loyalties. Children were taught to say king in a new way, to bow differently, to forget differently. But some names would not vanish. Choi Young was not revered. Not officially. He was too complicated, too uncontrollable, too dangerous to the story the court wanted to tell. But neither could he be demonized. He had not stolen power. He had not betrayed. He had not corrupted. He had simply stayed loyal. And that made him harder to erase than the rebels, more persistent than the traitors. Because his defiance was quiet, and his downfall clean. In the polished archives of the Joseon court, scribes struggled with what to do with him. The official record reduced him to a single epitaph. He opposed necessary reform. But beyond the scrolls, beyond the palace gates, beyond the reach of red ink, his memory grew. He became a shadow beneath the throne, an unspoken measure, a question no one could fully answer. Every time a minister signed a death warrant in the name of order, they remembered the man who had been killed for following it. Every time a scholar praised Confucian loyalty, they paused, thinking of the one man who had lived that virtue too far. Every time a soldier was told to serve without question, his eyes flickered to the mountains where stories still whispered of a general who had done just that, and died for it. There were those who tried to revive his name. A century after his death, a royal scholar petitioned to restore Choi Young's titles. He argued that while the general's rigidity may have been politically inconvenient, it was morally unimpeachable. That he had not failed the state had failed him. The petition was rejected. Quietly, respectfully, but rejected all the same. The dynasty feared what might happen if the people began to question not who held power, but what that power owed to the men who made it possible. Still, his image returned in unexpected places. In a village schoolhouse, a child sketched a man standing in snow, facing away from a burning palace. When asked who it was, the child said, "My grandfather said he never left." In a remote shrine, a monk placed a bowl of rice before an unmarked stone and whispered, "For the sword that never asked to be drawn, and never asked to be sheathed." In the capital, during a parade honoring the founder of Joseon, an old man in the crowd muttered to no one in particular, "They ride on the spine of the man they broke." King Taejo, in his final years, grew ill with something his physicians could not diagnose. He slept fitfully. He spoke to people no one else saw. He asked strange questions about snow, about silence, about whether history could hear a man who never spoke a word in his own defense. Toward the end, he reportedly ordered that no portrait be hung in the royal hall beside his own. "There is already someone watching," he said, and when he died it was said the wind howled through the palace halls like a blade unsheathed one last time. Generations later, the tale of Choi Young would become a riddle told to aspiring court scholars. What do you call a man who obeys too well? That kingdoms rise on the backs of loyal men, and fall when they no longer know what to do with them. Choi Young was not the last general of Goryeo, but he was the last who believed. And in that belief, he planted a seed of unrest that even centuries of silence could not bury. He became not a monument but a fault line, running silently beneath the throne, waiting, not for vengeance, but for memory.